an influencer, a mentor to many, role model to our generation, Professor Patrick Lumumba. He is a Pan-Africanist, and please bear with me, I want to properly introduce Prof. I hope that everyone is able to join us on. Prof is a Pan-Africanist and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and Tanganyika. Is someone that a lot of us young Africans look up to for wisdom, for inspiration, for direction about what matters to Africa in this age. Tonight, we're hoping to hear from Prof about Africa in the age of Corona, the matter arising for the emerging generation. What are the things that the generation that is emerging, our generation, the younger generation of Africans that are growing today, what should we begin to think about? In particular, what lesson do we learn from Africa's response to coronavirus in Africa and the situation? Ladies and gentlemen, I wouldn't want to take your time because Prof has another meeting in 45 minutes. Please welcome to address us, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba.
Thank you very much, Israel, for inviting me to this conversation on a subject that is very topical now. But I believe that in order to appreciate where we are, it is critical that we give it a historical context. Africa has known epidemics. We will remember that this continent has been ravaged by malaria, which continues to kill many of our people. We'll remember that we have been victimized by yellow fever. We'll remember that we have been victimized by bilharzia, and we have been victimized by HIV/AIDS and Zika. But the uniqueness of this pandemic, now christened COVID-19 by the World Health Organization, is that for the first time in the lifetimes of many, it has shut down African economies in the same way that it has shut down the European and American and Asian economies. The jury is still out as to the true impact of COVID-19. But what we know now is that because of COVID-19, we have had restrictions throughout the continent of Africa. One will talk about the level 5 lockdowns, as we have seen in South Africa, and comparable lockdowns as we have seen in the entire SADC region. We have also seen similar lockdown scenarios in the East African region with varying degrees of severity. It may be a little relaxed in Kenya, Tanzania, and Burundi, but until the 4th day of May in Rwanda, it was a total lockdown in Kigali. Uganda is still going through a lockdown, as indeed in Central Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have similar lockdowns. In West Africa, we already are grappling with lockdowns in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, in Senegal, and in the Maghreb. We also know that there are lockdowns in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and of course, Libya cannot quite impose a lockdown because of the ongoing civil war. The impact can be seen, as a friend of mine says, from two different and diverse perspectives. And I'm using different and diverse in an unnatural way, but permit me to do so. That the issue is both a scientific one and it is also a moral one. Scientific in the sense that science now tells us that on the basis of the evidence that is available, it is incumbent upon all of us to observe certain basic hygienic requirements. We must put on the masks when we are in the public arena. We must sanitize. We must physically distance, and all those things that have now become part of our daily routine. But there are those who are also saying that the one-size-fits-all prescription, which is fundamentally Eurocentric, Asia-centric, and Americocentric, is not necessarily suitable for the African continent, given the nature of our societies. And there may be merit in such arguments, and we have seen the kind of reactions that have visited governments whenever there have been total lockdowns. In Kenya, only today, we have seen when only a small section of the country was locked down, the people came out and saying, we prefer to die of corona rather than to die of hunger. Which begs the question, when a country is confronted with a pandemic such as this, how should it respond? And there are many ways in which you can think about it. When the World Health Organization declares a pandemic, what it means is that that particular disease, if you may, covers the entire world. And I believe corona has now been registered in over 190 countries throughout the world. It means, therefore, that we must be our neighbor's keeper, because no matter what you do in your own environment, the likelihood of being affected by what your neighbor does or does not do is very real. So one of the things that I would have expected myself to be done in a very robust way, and I'm not saying that it has not been done, that is why I'm using the word robust, is that immediately the World Health Organization declared that corona or COVID-19 was a pandemic. At the regional level within the East African community, we ought to have had a concerted and coordinated response to the virus. So that if we are closing our borders, if we are having lockdowns, what is happening in Tanzania is comparable to what is happening in Kenya and in Uganda and in South Sudan and in Rwanda and in Burundi, and by extension in the Horn of Africa, in Djibouti, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. To my knowledge, that has not happened as robustly as it should have. I'm aware that certain meetings have taken place virtually, but in my view, these issues were not deliberated upon in the manner that I would have desired. In the SADC region, I would also have expected that what happened in South Africa would be the same thing as happened in Namibia and Angola and all the 14 SADC countries, largely in SADC, and I'm aware that meetings have taken place in that part of the world and that their activities have been fairly well coordinated, with the relaxation that is now happening in South Africa being emulated in Namibia and in Lesotho and in Eswatini and in Angola and in Mozambique. In West Africa, we also know that there was not any major coordination. I'm aware that the president of Niger, who is the current chairman of ECOWAS, did convene a meeting, and that meeting, certain things were agreed upon. But the reality is that there's no one size fits all, so that what is happening in Ghana is not necessarily what is happening in Nigeria. So our uncoordinated approach will, in the fullness of time, have certain negative effects in terms of the economy. The real impact of the coronavirus from the standpoint of infections and deaths cannot be compared to what we have seen in Spain or in Italy or in the United States of America or in China or in Korea. And there are those who are arguing, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm sufficiently curious to observe this, that why is it that the coronavirus is not as virulent in Africa as it is in other parts of the world. They are posing these questions. One may say rhetorically, but they may also be looking for answers. Is there a possibility that this strain of the virus does not survive and thrive in the tropical environment? That is question number one. Question number two, they are posing the question, is there a possibility that because Africa has continued to vaccinate people for BCG, for tuberculosis and other ailments, and that we are now reaping the dividends of those vaccinations? The third question that they are asking, is it because of the climatic condition, which may sound like a repetition of the first one, and that is why we are not finding ourselves in the manner, in the same situation as the Italians or the Spaniards or the Americans? And they possibly are asking, is it possibly because we are not testing as robustly as other parts of the world are? But if one were to doubt that question, if it were true that it is our non-robust testing that is the problem, why are Africans not found falling dead in different places in Nigeria or in Bangui in Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of Congo? These are questions for which we do not have answers now, because even the world of science is still divided as to the character and the nature of the virus that is been christened, as I've already said, COVID-19. But there is one thing that is undeniable, even as we speak now, that this virus and the lockdowns will have a devastating effect on the economic life of many African states. Let us look at it from a sectoral standpoint. Look at the sector of tourism. And when you are thinking about tourism, you are thinking about countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, the Rwanda, South Africa, the Seychelles, Madagascar, Namibia, the Gambia, which depend on tourism as their sources of income. That particular sector is decimated and devastated. If you go into the hospitality industry, which is also closely allied with it, many hotels in African countries are now closed, which means that those who are serving in that particular industry are completely devastated. If you go into the aviation sector, in which we are not very strong, but remember that we have thriving airlines such as Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, Air Peace in Nigeria, and many others in the western part of Africa and in the northern part of Africa, such as Air Egypt, Air Morocco, Air Tunisia, and those airlines. The pilots are now out of work, save for those who are engaged in transportation of cargo. And the accompanying services, such as ticketing services, and those who supply food for those services, those who provide insurance services for those particular enterprises. You go into the mining sector is undermined in a similar manner, and one can go on and on, but one need not do that in a forum such as this, save to point out that the net effect of the coronavirus after we are done with it is that the economies will be left devastated. Of course, as it is in Africa now, very few African institutions are actually engaged in monitoring how our economies are performing. So the literature and the research that we have will be research which is undertaken by American or European institutes such as Moody or McKinsey or Deloitte and Touche or KPMG or Ernst & Young or the IMF or the World Bank, and at best, if there is an African institution that is doing anything about it, it could be possibly the African Development Bank and possibly the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And all of them are returning one verdict, that our economies are going to shrink. And typically, when they talk about shrinkage, They're engaged in the science of economics. They'll talk about the GDP reducing. They'll talk about purchasing power parity. They'll talk about the per capita income. But in truth, I think that African economies are going to suffer in a devastating way, and many countries are going to have their economies shrink by no less than 30%. If you are to look, for example, at countries which depend on oil, such as Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, Ghana, and other countries of that in that particular neighborhood, the demand for oil and fossil fuel has reduced dramatically, and they are going to suffer in a very major way. If you look at countries such as Kenya, which also depend on floriculture, flowers are commodities of vanity. They only make sense when people are happy and want to enjoy. Now that particular sector is devastated. And the net effect, therefore, is that this particular virus has affected the world and Africa in a very fundamental way. But there is, one may say, a silver lining in this very dark cloud. That silver lining has been brought about by a number of things. And those include the recognition by Africans that going forward, we must be a people who produce things for ourselves. The very fact that we have had to depend on an Asian Chinese philanthropist or philanthropist, Jack Ma, to donate to us testing kits and ventilators and masks, tell us that we must do something about our health sector. It has exposed our underbelly in the health sector, that our levels of preparedness are at the lowest rung of the ladder, and that we do not have facilities that are capable of surviving and confronting and handling a crisis such as this. So going forward, I hope that those who are in the political class and who have the burden and the duty to ensure that the people's health is protected going forward will have a clearer vision when they are preparing their budgets and making allocations. It has also demonstrated to us that our research institutes are very weak and that we depend on other civilizations for determining what it is that we use as testing reagents. We have been depending on China thus far, and yet we have research institutes. I know for a fact, for example, that under the aegis of the African Union, we have 5 centers for disease control. We have one for the East African region, which is based here in Nairobi in Kenya. We have one that is based for the southern region, which is based in Lusaka in Zambia. We have one that is based in the Bangui, I think is based in the Cameroons for purposes of Central Africa. We have one that is based in Egypt for the Northern Africa, and we have one that is based in Nigeria for the Western region. I may have made a mistake on the Central African, but there is one for Central Africa. That in itself is useful. What we must then do is to ensure that we have sufficient funding for these institutions going forward, because this is not the last pandemic. We are going to have several pandemics. Remember, as I said at the very beginning of this conversation, we have had cholera in this part of the world. We had Ebola. We have had Zika, which is still alive and well. We have had yellow fever. And our levels of preparedness will depend on the level of our investment in the scientific arena. The other area that has exposed that very badly is in the area of pharmaceutics. We do not have any pharmaceutical companies that are worth speaking of. And if you look at the 15th largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, they are either American or European or Asian. And when I talk about Asia, they are either Indian or Chinese, or Japanese at best, and occasionally they are South Korean. The pharmaceutical companies that we have in Africa will be branches of either Johnson or Roche or Novartis or any one of these multinationals. And that is why it gladdens me that at least during this period, we have seen efforts by a number of African countries to enter into the fray. The announcement by the people of Madagascar, the people of Madagascar, through their president, Andry Rajoelina, that they have come up with a herbal cure called COVID organic is a good thing. And I'm not unaware that there are those who have been condemning this. They will do so, but those are efforts which must be praised because that is research in its embryonic days. And is beginning to send a very clear message that if we are focused as Africans, we are capable of solving our problems, because in any event, if you look at many of the medicines that are doled out to us from Europe and America and Asia, the primary ingredients are found in the forests of Africa or in the Amazon in Latin America. And going forward, we must look inward, and this can only happen through coordination and research. I'm also happy that the Senegalese, during this period, were able to produce testing kits which cost less than $1, and that this could be deployed and you have your results within a single day. And these things are useful because they do a number of things. One, they demonstrate to the world that Africans are capable of engaging at a very high level in scientific activities. Number two, they reinforce African confidence in themselves. And number three, they demonstrate to Africans that if we collaborate sufficiently, we are capable of contributing to the world in a very fundamental way in critical areas which people thought were very arcane areas of science. But let me go back to the whole idea of collaboration, because I think this is critical. What is it, if any, that we have learned from this coronavirus? And I talk about coronavirus in the past tense rather deliberately because I prefer to look to the future rather than to be a prisoner of the past and the present, because I believe that coronavirus as we know it now will be with us for some time. Malaria has been with us for some time. HIV/AIDS is with us and we have learned to live with it. Yellow fever is with us and we have learned to live with it. So it will be with coronavirus. So how do we behave going forward? Going forward, we must have a new normal. And that new normal requires a number of things. One, that we as Africans, whether in the mother continent or in the diaspora, must now recognize that when the chips are down, the world can gang up against you. And if one ever doubted this, one need only ask the Africans who are marooned in China, whether they were marooned in Guangzhou or marooned in Shenzhen or marooned in anywhere in China. They were told by word and deed that your skin color can affect how you are treated. And it was not only in China that Africans experienced this. In a much less publicized way, Africans were denied treatment in Italy. And that in itself indicates to the Africans, wherever they are, that we have a duty to ourselves, whether you are an African whose ancestors were long seized and taken to the Caribbeans, or to the United States of America, or to Europe, or any other part of the world. When the chips are down, it is your Africanness that defines how you are treated. So Africans in the diaspora must now work with Africans in the mother continent as we begin to see how we will redeem ourselves and save ourselves from the pain that have been inflicted upon us by the coronavirus. Secondly, this particular pandemic has told us that as Africans until now, we were ill-prepared, and that going forward, we ought to be prepared in the health sector, that we have not consumed and utilized and deployed technology in the manner that we ought to have deployed it, and that going forward, therefore, it is incumbent upon us to invest in technology and to ensure that we reap the dividends of technology. And it comes at a time when Africa is, like the rest of the world, is talking about the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution. What are we going to do with the fourth industrial revolution? When we are talking about robotics, how can we use robotics in the health sector? And I'm happy to say that Rwanda has demonstrated that it can be used. Ghana has demonstrated that it can be used, and that that is the way to go. We have also recognized that as a third thing, that Africa has until now not invested in research and development, and that African universities now must occupy their pride of place, and they can only occupy their pride of place when African governments and African institutions make a deliberate effort to fund research and development. This is also true of African institutes of research and development. And in this regard, it is incumbent upon me to recognize the Malagasy Institute of Applied Science, which has come up with COVID organic, which I've already talked about. In the area of education, we have also recognized that education is very significant, and that many African schools, whether it is in the primary sector or the tertiary sector or the universities, are not prepared to deploy education material through technology. And that going forward, it is important that we focus in that area, because the education is very critical in terms of preparing young men and women for purposes of competing in the world. The other thing that has emerged during this particular era is the weakness of our economies. Our economies are too dependent on foreign economies, and that is why almost every African country has now found itself borrowing from the World Bank, or borrowing from Scandinavian countries, or borrowing from Western institutions in order to fight COVID-19. This is not sustainable. I would have loved myself to see a more robust African Development Bank. And one of the things that we must do post-corona is to redefine the role of the African Development Bank, and to ask ourselves how it is that we can finance the African Development Bank. And I think there's been a lot of thought around this particular problem, and going forward, we must think a lot more keenly. The other thing that is critical is the role of young Africans. In fact, there are commentators who have said that part of the reason why Africa has not suffered as adversely as Europe and America is because we are a young population. But what do we do with our young population? With the devastation in the economies of Africa, it means that the opportunities for young men and women have been reduced. Opportunities for engagement in innovation and invention. What do we do with this young population, most of whom are now returning from Europe, Asia, and America back to the mother continent? What can we do to ensure that going forward they are engaged meaningfully within the context of, in the ecosystem of the African continent? And that is what brings me to the role of a number of institutions. And I'll do this by, number one, saying that within the domestic arena, the individual countries have duties. Whether you are talking about Niger or Gambia or any one country, in the domestic arena, they have a duty to focus on the unique and peculiar aspects of those countries. But when you are dealing with a pandemic, you cannot be isolationist. You must think about the region, which then begs the question, What is the role of regional bodies? What is the role of ECOWAS? What is the role of SADC? What is the role of East African Community? What is the role of IGAD? What is the role of Central African Organization? What is the role of the Maghreb? And all these must be coordinated under the aegis of the African Union, which then makes me ask the question, is the African Union as presently constituted capable of responding to the needs of the continent of Africa? The answer is no. And I'm aware that in 2016, the African Union tried to reform herself through the Paul Kagame reforms, which are still being undertaken. And I'm saying that African Union must now rethink her mandate and how she's going to use her station and her influence within the continent of Africa to address many of the issues that I have raised. It is also important that African Union now begins to give meaning to her programs such as Africa Agenda 2063 and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I say all these because post-corona, there will be a new normal. That new normal will end up with an international community that is devastated. The institution from which Africa was borrowing will no longer be willing or able to lend, whether they are the IMF or the other Bretton Woods institution, whether they are the Scandinavian countries or the European Union. They'll be dealing with things in their backyard. And everybody in the next 4 to 5 years, at the very minimum, will be compelled to look within the domestic arena. How are we going to behave? How are we going to use our professionals? And how are we going to compensate them? What environments are we going to create for them to operate? How are we going to deal in an environment where some of the economic activities that sustained us are no longer available to us? It requires disruptive thinking. And disruptive thinking means that we can no longer think within the box or outside of the box, but without the box, which means that we must think very differently and we must think in a very revolutionary manner. And that requires coordination. And that is what I want to conclude with. I want to conclude by saying that in our lifetimes, we have seen a pandemic which is no respecter of boundaries. We have seen a pandemic that has demonstrated to us that a virus is stronger and more powerful than the nuclear bomb. We have seen a pandemic which tells us that possibly we have been investing in the wrong areas, that while we have been investing in building our armies and buying armaments, this new enemy is devastating, subterranean, and quite pernicious. How, therefore, do we tackle her? We tackle her through science, we tackle her through invention, we tackle her through innovation, we tackle her through coordination, we tackle her by working together as Africans, we tackle her by looking at our health sectors, we tackle her by revamping our education sectors, we tackle her by doing things for ourselves, we tackle her by coordinating our activities, we tackle her by trading with ourselves, we tackle her by thinking differently, we tackle her by collaborating with ourselves, both within the mother continent and with our kin and kith outside of the continent. The truth is, history has been consistent. Fortune favors the vigilant and the daring. We must dare and be vigilant going forward. Thank you.
opening statement and your keynote. We're now going to go into the question and answer session. And I have a lot of questions here. I have some questions I also want to ask, but I will take one or two questions first from the audience. Then I will come to some of my questions and go back to the audience question. One of the questions from the audience says, does Professor have any thought as to the biggest barriers to intra-Africa trade, intra-Africa cooperation, and how to summon them? Does Prof have any thought as to what the biggest barriers are to intra-Africa cooperation and how to summon them? And what is the role of the private sector in all of this?
Thank you very much.
We
can take a few and then we answer them.
Okay, the question is, does lack of proper identity management system also limit the effectiveness of our strategy as a continent? That's from DMO.
Identity.
Then there's, yes, identity management system. Let me pick one or two for me. You've talked about investment in science and tech, investment in research and development. The reality is that millions is being budgeted every year across Africa for this kind of thing, but because of corruption, those money are being siphoned. How do we deal with corruption in the health sector and in other sectors to be able to deal with these challenges?
Thank you. Let me take those questions. The first question is, what stands in the way of African unity and collaboration? It's very simple. It's the egos of the political class. People are so wedded to their little countries. If you find the president of a little country with a population of 2 million, they are so used to being called the presidents and they identify with these little entities which are not viable. And I think the proper answer to that question was given initially in 1963 on the 25th day of May by Kwame Nkrumah, when he warned that if we delay our unity, people will get used to their titles and to their positions and to the so-called sovereignties of their countries, and it will be very difficult to unite. And that is one of the problems. The same was repeated on the 6th day of March in 1997 in Accra, Ghana, by Julius Kambarage Nyerere, when he said, Africans should remember that when we go out there, it is not our Ghanaian-ness that matters, or Beninois-ness, or Togo-ness, or Cote d'Ivoire-ness, or Algerian-ness. It is our African-ness. But because of the ego of the political class, the whole idea of African unity will be delayed, possibly for another generation. If we recognize that our unity, and when we talk, our unity is critical. And when we talk about unity, we are not naive. We are not thinking that one day African countries will simply say, we have dissolved our countries and we are one. We are saying that there are movements and steps that can be taken in an orderly manner. And we are already talking about them. We are saying, let us have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area so that we remove tariff and non-tariff barriers. Then we move into the arena of free movement of passports. That is why we have the African passport. Then we move into a common market. Then from the more common market, we move into a monetary union. When we have moved from the monetary union, then we go into a political federal union, where Namibia remains as Namibia in the same way as the state of California is the state of California, but is a part of the federal United States government. Or the state of Amritsar is part of the Indian subcontinent. That can be achieved. And this is the time when we must recognize that that is the only way to go. And it is not going to be easy. It is not going to be for the faint-hearted, and which brings me to the question of identity. We are wedded. You know, when you look at, take for example, the country, one of the countries I love most is Nigeria. And Nigeria is a country, is a fiction. The thing called Nigeria is a fiction that was created by Lord Lugard in 1914. And if you doubt me that Nigeria was a fiction, just listen to the early sentiments of the leader of the North in Nigeria, like Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Sultana of Sokoto, or listen to Obafemi Awolowo, who is from the West, or Akintola, or listen to Nnamdi Azikiwe, or listen to Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, to know that even them, they did not have faith in this artificial entity. Or listen to Omar el-Bashir before he was disposed, and John Garang de Mabior, when they were talking about Sudan and Southern Sudan. Having recognized that, we now have so much faith in these artificialities and these boundaries, which we said were inviolable at the meeting in Cairo, that we don't look at the bigger picture, that our diversity is actually our strength. And I commend to my listeners to read a book written by the famous and very intelligent Kenyan Professor Ali Mazurui. He has written a book called The Power of Babel, not the Tower of Babel. He talks about the power of Babel, that our diversity is our unity. So that if we were to use our talents, you think of a situation such as this, that we were to put together the entrepreneurial ability of the Igbo of Nigeria. We were to look at the energy of the Zulu in South Africa. We were to look at the aristocratic orientation of the Banyankole in Uganda. We were to look at the quest of efficiency of the Luo in Kenya, and we were to go to the Bangala in the Democratic Republic of Congo and look at their sense of humor. And we were to go to the Mende and the Temne and look at all those, and you put them together. That would be a recipe for something that is great. And there can be something to be said that is positive about all the 3,000 plus nations in Africa. It would be a power of Babel. It can be done. But once again, as I said, it is not going to be for the faint-hearted. And you've talked about science and technology. It is not lost on me that even during this period when the prime minister of one of the African countries was sick, he was airlifted to France. How can it be that almost on average 60 years after independence, most African countries are incapable of having hospitals which are world-class? And you have said it rightly, in the past, people would have budget allocation for the health sector, and then that money is taken to be kept in Switzerland or in Guernsey or in Cayman Island. But now that our politicians have been locked down in Africa, I think they'll think very differently. And I have no doubt that going forward, we are going to improve our health facilities. Which brings me to a question which I was about forgetting. What is the role of the private sector? The private sector is very critical in this regard, because the private sector is the prime mover, with the government or the administration providing an enabling environment. And we have seen a number of Africans doing very well in the private sector arena. If you look at somebody like Aliko Dangote, who is now present in almost 18 countries. You look at our own in Kenya, Manu Chandaria, who is present in almost 10 countries. You look at Patrick Mosepe, who is strong in the mining sector. You look at Obi Jackson in Nigeria, who is strong in the oil and gas sector. You look at Sawiris in Egypt, who is strong in very many other sectors. You look at Tony Elumelu in Nigeria, who is strong in the banking sector. James Mwangi in Kenya, who is equally strong in the banking sector. These are individuals who are now defying boundaries and sending a clear message that the private sector cannot be ignored in our quest to ensure that Africa realizes our potential. And going forward, this is the kind of orientation that we should have. And I hope and believe and pray, if one must pray about it, that going forward, particularly post-corona, we are going to have very different thinking, and the African politician is going to liberate himself and herself from this quest for material aggrandizement without looking at the interests of the population whom they have the honor and privilege of serving. We
from the side, he muted himself. I think somebody should.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
Tell him he muted himself.
Just ask him to conclude it. I now have another call. Hello? Yeah, good evening.